Today I'll be talking about the theories of Karl Marx, a prominent sociologist and commonly referred to as the father of modern sociology. He's also a extremely important figure in Sociology Chapter 4, Western Sociologists. Before we look at his theories, let's look at his biography. Karl Marx was born on 5th May 1880 in Trier, part of the Rhineland province of Prussia in Germany. He was the son of a prosperous liberal lawyer. He studied law at the University of Bonn and then at the University of Berlin, where he was much influenced by a group known as the Young Hegelians. In 1841, he completed his doctoral thesis in philosophy from the University of Jena. In 1844, he met Friedrich Engels in Paris, who became a lifelong friend and was also a significant contributor to many of his works. In 1847, Marx and Engels published the notoriously famous Manifesto of the Communist Party, which is not only a book but also a pamphlet informing and provoking the youth to adopt the idea of communism or socialism. In 1849, he was exiled to England and lived there till his death. In 1852, he published the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. 1859, a contribution to the critique of political economy. 1867, thus Capital. And in 1883, he died and was buried in London's Highgate Cemetery. Marx's theories mostly revolved around the criticism of capitalism, because he grew up in the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution. He believed that capitalism and the idea of private property were the root of all ills, and capitalism was the height of exploitation of man. But what is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned, and there's only one goal: minimal investment and maximum return on investment. So the capitalist society was a time of growing urbanization, smog-filled cities, and it's the general squalor of the working classes. The cities were completely different than what they looked like a few hundred years ago. So now let's try to understand what modes of production are. Earlier we mentioned that an economic system in which means of production are owned privately is known as the idea of capitalism. But what is MOP? MOP refers to the factors of production plus the relations of the production. The factors of production are, as we learned at a very early age, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. And so these factors, the land, labor, and the capital, are privately owned by one individual or group of individuals. And the relations of production are the relation between the employer and the employee. So in the capitalist society, the factors of production were owned by one person, and the relations of production were constantly strained. In capitalism, the factors of production were machines, and the goods were being mass-produced. So this led to two issues: one, unemployment, and two, the status of a skilled craftsman significantly declined, because the value of the goods decreased, and the quality also witnessed a similar decline. The goods were being produced in the masses, and there wasn't enough time for them to be handcrafted and made with high craftsmanship and quality. And the relation of production was also strained because of the concept of cash nexus. There were more impersonal relationships between the employer and the employee. Earlier, if we think about the economic system before capitalism, it used to be a feudal system, where the serfs or the bonded laborers would work under the landlord, and their payment would not usually be in money or cash. It would be in kind. So they would be paid with a small percentage of the grain. And so they would work and earn the products that they produced. So if they produced wheat, their earnings would also be in wheat. And this created a stronger relationship between the employer and the employee. And also there was constant interaction between the employer and the employee. Whereas in the factories of capitalism, the workers were paid in cash. They didn't have any relation with the actual products that they produced. Because there was also the concept of the assembly line. So if we are producing a toy car, one person would paint the car, one person would assemble the wheels, one person would give it a polishing, and one person would put it inside the package. So with each person being divided, people had no relation with the goods that they were producing, and they weren't being paid in the goods that they were produced. They were being paid in a cash nexus. So they were given wages based on the number of hours that they worked a day. And also the capitalist was very distant from the employees, so the relationships were also strained in that manner. So we can summarize that the creativity of the skilled craftsmen was stifled. The theories of Marx can be categorized into three broad theories, which are theory of alienation, theory of class struggle, and theory of historical materialism. The first theory of Marx was the theory of alienation, which states that the capitalist society alienated man, which means separated or isolated man from nature, other individuals, products of his own labor, and himself. How did the capitalist society alienate man from nature? We know that the pre-industrial society was completely agriculture based. So people worked in the fields to produce the goods that were required to satisfy their needs. This means that they had an intimate relation with the nature, the fields, the soil, the water, the rainfall. They had a strong, tight-knit relation, and their production was also dependent heavily on nature. Whereas in industrial societies, people worked in factories, which were usually filled with smog. They were dark, dimly lit. They worked with machines, and they only transformed the raw material from nature to more valuable goods. So they didn't have any connection with nature at all. Instead of working on the fields, they were working inside the man-made barracks or the factories. They were also alienated from other individuals because, as I mentioned earlier, the assembly line led to the division of labor, and people no longer interacted with each other in the production like they used to in pre-industrial societies. When they were working on the fields, they used to speak with each other, communicate, and there was a high level of collectivization in production. But the capitalist idea led to the division of labor, where every individual was assigned a few tasks every day, and he had to complete those tasks with no interference or communication with others. The capitalist society also alienated man from products of his own labor. As I also mentioned earlier, there was no more payment in kind, and people never knew what goods they were actually producing because they would only produce a small part of it. The assembly line divided their production, and they would only be paid in cash nexus, so they weren't consuming the goods that they produced, and this led to a strained relation of production. They weren't as connected or invested towards their labor because they wouldn't even be looking at the goods that they produced. This may seem absurd, but if we think about it, earlier the skilled craftsmen, they would spend days or even months perfecting their small piece of textile, and they would feel so proud of that textile because it's the fruits of their own labor. Whereas in the capitalist society, they weren't able to utilize or have a hand feel of the goods that they produced. So it was really alienating them from true satisfaction. Because it seemed like they were working for a capitalist, they were working for the fat cats to only expand their profits, but they had no true work satisfaction. Lastly, the capitalist society alienated man from himself. His true personality was being stifled by the repressive capitalist division of labor model. He had to produce the goods based on the terms of the capitalist, or the factory owner, and not himself. He had no creativity whatsoever. And keep in mind that the people that came to work in these factories at one point were highly skilled, valued craftsmen. But now they were just producing goods on terms of the capitalist. The next theory is the theory of class struggle. Karl Marx believed that at one point there would be a sense of class consciousness between the working class, or the proletariat, and this would be an antithesis towards the thesis, which was the idea of capitalism. And at some point, the synthesis or the solution would arrive, which was a socialist society. So the thesis was capitalist, the antithesis was the revolt of the workers through class consciousness, and the synthesis was supposed to be socialism. Karl Marx believed that capitalism would sow the seeds of its own destruction because, although it was an economic regime which was only seen in prisons, the factory could also be liberating, potentially, because it united the workers at one place, and it taught them how to make concerted efforts towards accomplishing one goal. It taught them the skills of teamwork and collaboration, because every day the goods that they produced were a collective effort from all of them, although not directly, because they didn't work together, they were alienated from themselves. They were still gathering in the same place, experiencing the same struggles, and at one point they would have no choice but to revolt, because their ideas would streamline, and they would finally understand the drawbacks and the oppression that they were going through. So Marx believed that the capitalist society would actually be beneficial towards the formation of a socialist society. However, in truth, this never actually happened. The last theory is the theory of historical materialism, which states that history was formed on the basis of material things or economic conditions and not ideas. Karl Marx divided history into several phases based on the means of production. First, it was primitive communism, followed by slavery, feudalism, and then capitalism, which was supposed to be followed by socialism, but it never happened towards the masses. It was limited to few regions. So in the division of history by Marx, primitive communism was an early form of communism where the resources were distributed equally, and it was the closest thing to an egalitarian society. Then that was followed by slavery, in which people began to own other people, and there's a commoditization of man. This was also in terms of economic conditions because people employed other people to carry out the daily economic activities. This was followed by feudalism, which was an agriculture-based economic system where the landlords controlled the agricultural activity, but the actual on-field activities were controlled by tillers, and they'd be given a small percentage of the yield as their profit. And lastly, capitalism, which we already discussed. So all these phases of history were defined and formed based on economic conditions and nothing else. So this was Marx's perspective that history was determined based on material things and not ideas. We can also see that in his idea of substructure and superstructure. In society, the base was the substructure, which is economic conditions, and on top of this base, other factors of society, other aspects were determined, such as politics, culture, and social interactions. These were all determined based on the economic conditions. So the superstructure was highly dependent on the substructure. So that concludes this video on Karl Marx's theories. He was a visionary with an aim to create an egalitarian society, and his theories were extremely thought-provoking, to a point where he was constantly exiled to different countries because they wanted to control the spread of his radical ideas. Unfortunately, his ideas and vision never came true, but I still believe that his perspective was radical and thought-provoking, especially considering the time period that he was born in, when the Enlightenment period had just ended. So as always, I hope you had a good learning experience, and until the next one, this is Initial Tube signing off. Peace.